So welcome everyone. This is Rebecca Smith-Aldridge from the Mid-Hudson Library System, and you're here this morning for the Inside and Outside of Evaluations webinar, how they impact planning, growth, and funding. We're so lucky today to have Dr. Terry Kirchner from the Westchester Library System with us this morning, and he's going to be talking about how to tie director and board evaluation to library vision and long-range planning to produce meaningful results for your community. So just a little background on Terry. Not only is he the executive director of the Westchester Library System, he has a master's in library science, a master's in business administration and industrial organizational psychology, and a PhD in human and organizational systems, in addition to being a certified executive coach. So this is a topic that I think he has a lot of background in. I got to see this presentation earlier this year at the Library Trustee Association conference in Plattsburgh and knew immediately it was a good fit for the libraries here in the Mid-Hudson Library System. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Terry. And Terry, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Well, my pleasure. So quickly, just kind of want to run through a couple of things. What I'd prefer is that we hold questions till the end. I'll leave some time. I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. Understand that my goal is really to just inspire different ways to think. And it may be that through this process you become convinced that what you're doing is right, and that's wonderful, or it may be that you might want to try something different. But what I'm hoping is that you will just think a little bit more about what it is that you're doing every day as you try to build your board and as you try to build your relationship with the director, as a director, with your staff. Everything that we do has so many different parts. And part of what I'm hoping that we will look at today is how all these parts interact. And really, the big question that we're looking at is, sort of the evaluation processes that we're using to understand our success. How well does our evaluation process really help us understand and support the mission, vision, and values that we're putting forward? And one of the things I don't want to do is just read all these screens, so you will have access to all of them. But I want to just remind us that at the end of the day, within our organization, which is the library or the library system, we're really trying to push forward our mission, vision, and values. And with everything that we do, these should be the driving forces that really help us, sort of focus and redefine the work that we're doing. But at the end of the day, it's all about people. It's the people who really support our organization, and it's the people who embody and live the mission, vision, and values. And the evaluation processes that we use, one would hope that they actually help us as people to feel inspired rather than defeated by the work that we're trying to achieve. And we've already talked about this, but basically, we want to make sure that we really are accomplishing what we want. Board governance. So evaluation of boards is probably one of the hardest things in the sense that boards do so many different aspects. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that any evaluation process that we do within the board helps to build that trust relationship. Trust between board members, trust between staff and the board, and ideally between the library, the board, community. Libraries are successful when there is trust between their community and their library. And what we want to do is build relationships and systems and structures that support that trust throughout the process. And one of the things that I think is easy to forget is the power of language. The words that we use have a direct impact on how we see the world, and also how we prioritize, and also how we feel and experience the world. So one of the things I want us to all think about as we do the evaluations of ourselves as board members, or of the director, or of staff, is what is the impact of the words that we choose? So we're going to do just a quick little run through of something that can be an exercise that boards can do for themselves as part of sort of a self-evaluation, but also library staff can do this. So this is basically a team-building exercise around the core common values of libraries. So there's democracy, equity of access, intellectual freedom, literacy and learning, logic, privacy, service, and stewardship. So what you can do is, as a group, have a conversation about these values. What I recommend is that everyone identify 3 of the top values that are meaningful to them, and then as a group talk about it. What generally happens through this process is that we realize all of these values are incredibly important, but each of us might have different values that are the driving factors for us. And based on each of our priorities, we may hear and we may speak things a little bit differently than someone else, even though we may share in some of the common goals. This is really an easy and kind of fun exercise to do. It's easier than some of the other icebreakers in that it doesn't feel silly. It feels very focused on the mission, vision, and values of the library. If you're looking for a way to maybe spark different communications amongst your staff members or your board members, this would be an exercise to try. And I can definitely talk more about this later if it's of interest. And I'd already spoken about this with the whole notion of values and communication, but I think it just bears repeating that the values are really the essence that people hear when we speak, and it's also the filter that we use when we listen. And basically, if we're going to have shared values and shared goals and a shared purpose, it's got to be tied to something. And I would say values are probably one of the easiest ways to build that shared goal together. So one of the reasons I put this special thanks slide in is just a reminder for boards in particular, but also directors, the importance of building in professional development time and really a budget line whenever possible for opportunities for staff to step outside of their normal work environment. So ALA, PLA, regional professional opportunities, any kind of training that staff members can get outside of the library allows a new perspective to sort of come back and look at yourself differently, to challenge your own values and your perspective. One of the things that I often hear is that there's absolutely no money in the budget for training. I would challenge that, because even if there's not money, there's probably the ability to offer flex time or something else. So one of the things you'll probably learn about me is that I don't really believe in the word no. I usually rephrase that as not now. Because if something's really important, part of our goal is to figure out how to make it happen if we're really interested in something as a true value. And one of the challenges, I think, for all of us with professional development is to prove to others that it has value. So I always encourage all of us to remember to share the things that we've learned. And actually, out of this conference that I went to, this presentation basically took its life. So you never know when something you hear and learn will kind of merge into something new. All right, back on topic. Board self-evaluation questions. One of the common issues I think people have about board evaluation is that it can appear very overwhelming. There are quite a few websites or books that will give you laundry lists of pages of surveys that people can fill out with all kinds of questions. I would actually encourage all of us to start simple and start with some open-ended questions and really focus on sort of proactive, future-looking things. what are the shared values, shared aspirations, how prepared are we? Just kind of start with the foundation. With the foundation, then other things can grow, but you have to have a strong foundation first. And for many of this is a new process, so I also encourage us to create structures that allow us to succeed. And I think with these 4 basic questions, you and your board can sort of moving forward fairly easily, because you'll understand where you are and where you hope to be. So this is actually meant to be an aspirational diagram, in the sense that we really don't think about the boards as an entity that can evolve over time. One of the challenges many of us have is that we get so caught up in the day-to-day operations of the library as a board member or as a director that we sort of forget about looking out and thinking, well, where else can we go? So one of the challenges that I have is for people to think about how can they move their board from the consent to the working to the strategic and then to the mindful, recognizing that there may be elements of each that you can start to incorporate in. And I'll talk a little bit here about each of these just to kind of give it some perspective. So the consent board is basically the core foundation. And I'll be honest, not all of our boards are at the consent phase yet. With the consent board, basically the trustee handbook will have been fully embraced, followed, 99% of the time. The core structure and operations of board governance are in place. When we move into the working board part, this is really where the stronger committee structure takes place, that the work is not necessarily being driven so much by the director, but it is the board itself that's starting to find and create its own voice and learning how to sort of work together towards common goals. Strategic is when it gets a little bit more interesting in the sense that you've really identified a common issue that's going to move the library forward. Oftentimes it's an issue around literacy or something that's traditionally a library issue. And it's really an anchor point for the library to establish itself in the community as a leader in a field. Oftentimes we see this with youth services, so it's early literacy or an issue like that. One of the challenges is that it tends to be just in one direction. So when it's going really well, that's wonderful, but it might start to limit some of your capacity for further growth. And that's where this notion of mindful board starts to step in, because with mindfulness, what's really happening is that you're starting to think about how your strategic issue actually relates to the broader community. So who are the natural partners that you can work with? And part of this is thinking about how to maximize limited resources. So this whole notion of sustainability, how does your library, sort of survive and thrive in the future? That's very much related to mindfulness in the sense that there are probably natural partners, if we want to do with the literacy example. So there's literacy, volunteers. There's also food banks, because quite honestly, if people are hungry, they can't really learn well. There's, citizen groups. There's all kinds of different factors that tie in. So one of the things a mindful board would do is reach out into the community and actually start to promote their partners a little bit differently. So a library wouldn't necessarily be championing its role in the community. It might be a champion for someone else who has a shared vision, and together you start to build your relationship over time so that you don't actually expend any more resources as the library, but yet you get a lot more attention because another group is starting to cross-promote you. They understand your services better, so they have better referrals, and you have better referrals to them. It's a way to start to build that web of interaction amongst the different organizations. And what happens is that you get that synergy and that positive growth that really assists everyone to achieve their own individual missions, visions, and values while supporting related ones as well. I know that's a whole lot to throw at you, but I think it's not so much understanding specifically what each of these does as much as just recognizing that there is this aspiration that boards can have to move forward and grow and be a little bit different than perhaps we've always thought of boards as more of that governance role. And I think one of the most interesting things for me about the notion of mindful boards is that they have fearless engagement. This whole notion that we don't always have to play it safe, that we can take chances, and that if we're transparent in this process of working with the community about why we're taking this chance, there really is no failure, because if you're trying to, to achieve and meet different community needs, that's a positive thing, not a negative thing. So part of it is looking at how can we as boards take action that is more proactive rather than reactive, so that there's never this sense of failure, but always a sense of success and learning, sort of that lifelong learning notion that we're trying to convey to the community. But I realize, I'm being a little bit Pollyanna here. There will always be resistance to almost everything. And I think one of the things we have to think about is if we're going to move forward in trying to change and evolve the board, to recognize what would be some of the challenges to this. And I think, quite honestly, one of the biggest issues is that it takes a long time for change to occur. It's easy for us to forget that most of our libraries have been around for a very long time, some of them for hundreds of years. So how change happens will be slow. So we have to really think about how to keep the board engaged in this process for the long haul. The other challenge is, there are some deeply held status quo relationships between, how do boards exist as a board and how do they exist with their director. And a lot of this is driven by, past organizational structures. And what we'll talk about next is a little bit about ways to maybe change some of that so that it's easier for boards to move forward to the mindfulness that they might want to achieve. So now we're going to kind of stop with the board evaluation and go back to the evaluation of the CEO or the CEO for evaluating the staff. So it's more of the traditional performance evaluation process. One of the things that I think we forget about is that it's a fairly new phenomenon. That basically, it's the U.S. government over the past 100 years has sort of evolved this process. So it's not something that's always existed in the business community, but it's fairly recent. And I'm not going to read through all these, but I want you to just kind of get a sense of the timeline. That a lot of it started really around the notion of protection of employees. So it started with the Civil Service Act. And over time, it evolved that there were different versions of ways to rate people within the civil service perspective. The whole notion of this was intended to prevent favoritism, but I think as with any system, sometimes the intended goal isn't always the consequence. And we'll see over time that different evolutions occur to try to change the notion of how we evaluate. Here in 1935 is really when the standard system that we know started to take place. This is really when that notion of quality of performance and sort of that 5 5-point scale that we've often seen, from meets to fail, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all that sort of took place. What I'll say is one of the things that I've noticed, especially working in a smaller organization, is that oftentimes employees have conversations amongst themselves once the performance evaluation has occurred, and suddenly it's a rating scale judgment. One employee, gets a 24 and another one gets a 25, and then there's this discussion about, well, what have you done that I haven't done? Which is kind of ironic because it suddenly shifts the focus off a little bit of what the intention was, which was to rate people individually, and now they're starting to rate themselves against each other. So it creates a little bit of competition. In some ways, 1950 was really when things got a little bit rough from my perspective in terms of performance evaluations. That was the introduction of a couple of words, outstanding and unsatisfactory. I think in either way, when we start to give people certain words that they start to identify with as part of their identity, that can be challenging. Once we've identified someone as outstanding, it's very difficult for them to maintain that ranking. So the next year, if they don't achieve it, there's a little bit of frustration, and it could be a little bit demotivating, which is not what the intent was. And if anyone is rated as unsatisfactory, I think the intent was that that would motivate them to become satisfactory, but oftentimes it probably just encourages them to be even more frustrated with the process and not necessarily move forward in the positive direction that was intended. In 54, we just allowed merit increases. This is really 1954 with Peter Drucker. This is really where the whole notion of management by objectives, or MBO, influenced the evaluation process that we have today, basically because it created this whole notion of SMART goals. And I suspect most of us either currently do or have had environments where we rely specifically on SMART goals. And the SMART acronym is for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And there's nothing wrong with SMART goals. I think the challenge is, what is the impact of using SMART goals? Is it something that actually motivates people to move the mission of the organization forward, or is it something that really pushes them as individuals to achieve certain goals? And sometimes those two activities run in parallel, but sometimes they can start to diverge. And then I guess one of the challenges with this is that if we start to measure people strictly by objectives, what exactly does that mean for all the other aspects of the human experience? Especially if people are the core, are we only interested in what they do in terms of their outputs, or are we interested in everything that they value and add to the experience? And how much do the SMART goals capture the whole person versus just a part of what they try to achieve? So here's what I think is kind of a funny example of what a SMART goal relationship would sound like. So basically, if we took our personal relationships with a significant other as an example, this would be the conversation that you would have with that person as part of the SMART goal evaluation. Dear special somebody, it's time for your annual performance appraisal. For the sake of our relationship and the well-being of the family unit, I want you to prepare for a discussion of your strengths and weaknesses and the ways that you have fallen short of your goals for the year. Also, honey, for you to define some stretch goals for the coming year. Now, it sounds kind of absurd in one way, but in essence, this is the conversation that we're having with staff members. We are basically asking people to identify their strengths and weaknesses, tell us how they failed, and then what they're going to do next year that's going to sort of stretch their natural abilities so that they can set themselves up for failure again next year because they probably won't achieve everything. So one of my challenges to us as a community is how can we think about evaluation as a more transformative opportunity rather than as a punitive opportunity. ALA was interesting in the sense that initially they had a libraries change at your library PR message, and then they've switched over to libraries transform. And what they're really talking about is libraries transforming communities. But I think it would be interesting for us to kind of think about this in terms of how libraries transform themselves. What have we done as libraries to start to think about our internal structures and transform them so that we are better prepared for the future? I think it's easy for all of us to be stuck in survival mode sometimes, especially with the way that the world is, but that's not necessarily the structure or the framework that's going to help us to be what the communities need us to be as we go forward in the future. So here's really the crux of a lot of what I think is the big switch that we can look at doing within ourselves as libraries. And basically it's sort of challenging the status quo. Traditionally, most of us do performance reviews, and these are an annual review. I would encourage us to think about switching the terminology and the perspective so that we, instead of doing performance reviews, we do performance previews, which is basically a continuous process. What I'm suggesting is that there are ongoing conversations between the board and the director, and it could be that it's just between the board president and the director, but what we want to do is set up relationships that don't feel threatening, and it's really through that relationship building process that I think trust will start to develop in a deeper way. And part of this is switching away from the SMART goals, which really focus more on the individual skills and tasks, and start to transition over to the sort of the context and the partnerships. What are some of the challenges that are being experienced, by the director in their efforts to work with the board, to work with the community, rather than focusing just on the director's management, perspective. And it's really a switch from the past to the present and future. So rather than looking at things that have gone wrong or that have gone right, it's sort of thinking about, well, where are we now and where do we want to be? And this whole notion of being reactive, so do we think about, we just sort of respond to things that happen, or are we really trying to lay the groundwork for the direction that we want to move in? And if we're more proactive, then the other issues that we talked about, present and future orientation, the context and partnerships, ties in very closely with that. And it kind of shifts the purpose of the evaluation so that it's more about how can we identify the challenges that are out there and who are the natural partners to help us address those challenges. So the next issue, progressive discipline, is always a bit of a challenge because one of the things that happens with the evaluation process is that we get it confused with the progressive discipline process. Progressive discipline, to me, has sort of a negative connotation. I would encourage people to think about it in terms of progressive improvement. One of the ways to do this is to recognize that the performance preview process is about helping individuals or organizations move forward with some of the larger mission, vision, and value opportunities. As part of that process, we may notice that an individual is hindered in some of the work that they're trying to accomplish for whatever reason. It could be that they're having trouble getting into work on time, or there are some communication challenges that they're having with specific individuals. Rather than thinking of that in terms of progressive discipline, I would encourage us to think of it as a progressive improvement opportunity. You basically follow the same approach, which is you identify the situation that's happening, you talk to the person about it, you identify the challenges, why this is impeding the overall process, and then you work together on what are potential solutions, and then it's the same process of following up on the solutions. But I think if we focus it in terms of improvement rather than discipline, it adds a little bit of different perspective and value to it. It does a couple things though. One is, as a manager, it allows you to have the paperwork and procedure that you need should you get to the point of termination for an individual. But it also shows that you have positively and proactively worked to help that person improve in a way that's not always clear in the progressive discipline process, just because of that word discipline. The other thing is that the notion of power is very important here. Traditionally, we have a very hierarchical approach that one person has power over the other. As we focus more on performance previews and continuous conversations, we start to build a relationship that's more about shared power. And what happens with the shared power is that it allows people's strengths to showcase a little bit more, and it allows us to recognize, I think, a little bit more easily our own weaknesses and the areas that we're not so strong in. So because you know of other people's strengths and you recognize your own weaknesses, it's easier to start to build a relationship where you work together to sort of complement each other rather than working against each other or as competitors in the work environment. One of the other big challenges in the evaluation process is how people get paid. One of the things that we've been doing at Westchester Library System is really moving away from merit pay and more towards market-based pay. And what I mean by that is that when we hire individuals into our organization, we hire them at the salary that we feel is competitive and is what we can maximally offer. And then the evaluation at the end of the year for everyone in terms of pay increase is across the board. We have a flat pay increase for everyone. And part of that is to reduce some of the conflict that can happen in organizations if there are different pay rates for different people based on the evaluation scores that they receive as part of the annual performance review process. The other thing too is that the whole notion of pay can really get tied into this notion of trust, because how easy is it to trust someone if you're concerned that any issues that you might bring up would affect your overall pay at the end of the year. So it's, a lot of this stuff just kind of starts to build into itself. The other challenge is, how do you actually help create positive conversations? And I think for many of us, whether we're the board member or we're the director, it's hard to remember that we are technically the boss. So how do we create an environment where we have shared two-sided conversations where it's very easy for both individuals to talk about strengths and weaknesses, to talk about shared goals, rather than getting caught in that power dynamic where I, as the director, am uncertain if I want to bring forward an issue that I'm having to the board person because it might get reflected in my evaluation that I'm weak in this area. Meanwhile, if I had been able to bring this issue forward, we could probably address it proactively. So I'm sure it kind of sounds very complicated, but the truth is the more that we can build in opportunities for continuous conversation, my perception is that that actually creates opportunities for that power dynamic to equalize a little bit more, so that it's the evaluation process itself is sort of ongoing rather than just a once-a-year final situation. So now that I've probably thoroughly confused you, here's a couple things I just want to throw out there to help in starting some of these conversations that might be a little bit different. First is just to recognize that for both parties in the conversation, we each have imperfections, and we just need to own that. That there will always be some chemistry that exists between individuals. Sometimes that chemistry is positive, sometimes it's not. And if it's not positive, then the challenge is to think about, what are the areas where we could have positive chemistry? Maybe not on everything, but maybe there's a couple of things based on our mission, vision, and values that we can sort of work on together. And as part of the ongoing preview, it may be that you just want a set of a few questions that you can always have in mind. And here's 3 examples. And basically it's trying to depersonalize it a little bit in the sense of recognizing what's working well, what are some of the things that are making it a little bit more challenging to move forward, and then how can we do this better together going forward. And I think one of the challenges is the word use. It's kind of funny because when you go to some of the dealing with difficult people conversations, we're encouraged to avoid certain words, like you, they. You don't want to generalize. And I think in some ways this is very similar when we think about having the conversation with each other, is that we want it to be about our individual perspective. What is our experience? What happens to us when we work with a person? Not necessarily what do we think about that person. And part of what we want to try to do is focus very much on being open-ended in the types of questions that we ask, and to be curious and to be open to hearing new things that, well, we may not want to hear. But within each of those conversations, we probably have some room to grow. So I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, and I think, quite honestly, the questions, which I'm hoping are there, will be of more interest. But I did provide some resources that I hope will sort of guide you as you step back and want to maybe think about some of this and think about how it can be applied to your own organization. So I'm going to quickly exit out of here and get back to the GoToMeeting so we can see what's in the chat box.
So everyone who's in the call, you're welcome to put questions into the box. Terry, this is Rebecca, so I'll start with a question before we give people some time to put their questions in the chat box. Terry, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great, okay. So I was, as we want to give people some time to either format their questions or maybe they're kind of processing some of the stuff you shared, I wanted to ask a couple questions. I love this idea of the continuous conversation, so it's not just kind of like a surprise once a year about how things are going. But you also kind of hinted that the performance review itself, you think that, could you talk a little more about how structured that process should be? Something we always advise boards on is to work with their director to agree on a process for evaluation on an annual basis so the director knows what to expect and knows what they would be kind of evaluated against. Is that something you would still recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely have to be some, clear directions. And I think what I often do with my board and also with the employees that report directly to me is rather than having specific goals sometimes in terms of, you will achieve, 75% success on this, is talk about the direction, that we will be moving towards a 75% hit rate, by this date. And as part of the ongoing conversation and performance review, I would say that maybe quarterly or twice a year we'll have check-ins about this rather than just waiting until December 31st and then having it that I either succeeded or failed to achieve that goal. With the performance preview, the continuous conversation, it allows opportunities to talk about what's working well as we move towards this direction and what are the challenges that we anticipated or didn't anticipate as part of this, and so where does that leave us? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And how critical do you think it is to tie these performance previews to a library's long-range plan?
Oh, quite honestly, the long-range plan can be the driving force for all this. What I think is interesting is the whole the Harwood Institute approach, where it really is about aspirations. So if we think of the long-range plan as a statement of community aspirations, I like that in the sense that it does provide strategic directions, but it doesn't necessarily create an environment where we succeed or fail, but rather it just acknowledges that we're moving forward in the positive direction.
Talk a little bit about the, oh, sorry.
Yep, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, sorry, there's a bit of an echo there. I'm not sure why. But could you talk a bit about the difference between the format you would use when a board is doing an evaluation of a director versus evaluating itself versus the director evaluating the staff? Do you see those three types of evaluations taking on different formats or levels of formality?
Yes. So I think let's start with the board. For me, I think one of the biggest challenges in terms of board evaluation is really recognizing what are the values that the board members have and how do they see those values being expressed in terms of the work that the board's doing to support the mission and vision of the library, but also how they see that in terms of their relationship with the director. So a lot of this is a self-awareness aspect that the board, I believe, should embrace, which I think will help with a lot of the communication challenges that often occur between boards and directors. And that's why that exercise with just the different 8 core values can be helpful to start that conversation. I think, personally, every time a new board member comes on, it would be good to do some kind of shared values conversation or quiz, because the board dynamics will shift as different board people come on board. And part of it, I think, is for the director to be a little bit more proactive in knowing sort of what is the perspective of their board members, so that when the director is offering information, they can tailor that message, perhaps slightly differently based on the core values of each member. In terms of the board evaluating the director, I personally think it's important that a small contingent of the board be in continuous conversation with the director, that it may be the the executive group or just the board president, depending on the size of your board, that there are periodic check-ins for honest, realistic conversations about what's working well, what are the challenges, so that it's not in a public forum, but yet it's an opportunity for information to get shared and messages to be structured that could be brought back to the board as a unified front, so that it's not the director talking about failure, but rather the board president and the director talking about some challenges that are being experienced in moving forward on some of these initiatives. Part of what I'm hoping is that we can find ways to take the blame out of the conversations. And then in terms of working with staff, it can get a little challenging, I know, because of sometimes there's union environments or maybe even civil service where there are specific forms that need to be filled out as part of the contract. But I think that environment can run parallel with this whole notion of continuous conversation. One of the things that I've tried to do is find more opportunities to have conversations with staff about what's working well, what's not working well, so that there are no surprises when we get to the evaluation phase, that basically we've already had all these conversations and now we're just sort of summarizing it at the end of the year.
But it sounds like you would still integrate the long-range plan and the vision and the understanding of where we're going into the staff evaluation process, that there would also be kind of those shared vision exercises at each level of the organization. So evaluations still tie back to, are we fulfilling our mission and aspirations for the community?
Most definitely. Because at the end of the day, if the community's not excited by what we're doing, then we're not really doing what we need to do.
That's a great line. Very quotable, Terry.
Glad it's on tape.
So we're still waiting to see if anyone has questions. Just a reminder, you can pop those in the chat box. One thing that I know library people love is a form. Is there a recommended form for these types of conversations to kind of fill in the blanks or to create that record of the conversation? Is there any particular style form that you like, or is it less meaningful, do you think, than really the structure of that actual conversation?
What I would say is it's probably most important to identify maybe the 2 or 3 open-ended questions that you want to be part of every conversation. And that could basically be the form, what is working well, what are the challenges that we're experiencing, what could we do differently to, make things more successful. Even if it's just, those 3 simple questions, I think having that be a consistent part of the conversation will allow people to start to shift and sort of reframe their perspectives on the work that they do and how it relates to everything else.
I know I have one last question, if you don't mind, Terry. One of the issues that we work consistently with trustee education on is that issue you brought up before about between the board and director and that evaluation experience, how you make that less hierarchical. Because while technically the board has the fire to hire and fire the director, the truth is in between those 2 instances that are moments in time, you need to be partners in leading the library forward. And that seems to be a real critical point that you were making early on in the presentation. You were very clear to mention how important language is and how to shift the focus from a more punitive experience to a more collegial experience. And that seems to be one of the major keys that we've seen for successful libraries, when that relationship between the board and the director doesn't all of a sudden flip when it comes time for evaluation to that top-down feeling, but continues that kind of shared experience of how we're moving this library forward together.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, it's a tough transition to go from the traditional hierarchy to a flatter shared power structure. But I think part of it, well, part of it's complicated because oftentimes there are long-standing pre-existing relationships. So it can be difficult to start to make those changes so that we go from the traditional hierarchy to this flatter organization. What I would suggest is that oftentimes it might be easier to do it in small stages. To think about with the long-range plan per se. It's a 3 to 5 year plan. Maybe there's ways that you can think about how to shift the director and board conversations as part of that long-range plan. That each year, the evaluation process will get altered a little bit so that it's a proactive conversation about how we want to move our relationship to a different place within the next 5 years, rather than just trying to do it overnight.
I see we have 2 questions in the chat box, Terry, from participants. One is from Bob Miller, and he's asking if you could talk a bit about what are some keys to developing a long-range plan that will help with this evaluation process long-term, because it's come up again and again that the long-range plan, as Bob describes it here, is kind of the wellhead of the evaluation process.
So, yes, the long-range plan. I think part of what you want to make sure is that the conversations that you're having with this, whether it's with the board, the director, or the staff, that all this really does tie in so that the conversations help to support the long-range plan. And I guess historically we've sort of done it with SMART goals. But I'm suggesting that rather than just having goals that end, that we switch it more to directions, which are a little bit more open-ended, but yet still push forward. And I think part of that is recognizing that question about what are the challenges that you're experiencing in going forward in this direction. What are you experiencing that's not working well, and who are the potential partners, whether they're in the library itself or are they outside partners, that we could connect with and build a new relationship, so that it does support the long-range plan. To me, a lot of this is about how does the evaluation process help us establish new and effective conversations that sort of push everything forward. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's...
I think you did a great job, given that we could spend a whole hour just talking about a long-range planning process, which maybe is something for us to consider doing in the future here from Mid-Hudson. But I think the second question that you've got there might also help inform this. If your current long-range plan maybe isn't ideal, is there a short-term solution? Katie's asking about that values conversation at the board table that you had mentioned early on. She's wondering if you have a specific structure for having that conversation, and then, as you suggest, opening it up again as new trustees come onto the board.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly see it as kind of a quick activity, maybe a 10-minute activity at the most. You don't want to necessarily make it into too much, but part of the goal is to basically have people do a quick exercise where they identify their top 3 priorities. Out of that, the top 1 that they believe influences the way that they make decisions and the way that they hear information. Share that on a board, kind of get a general sense of those 8, what are the top ones that your board has, and recognize those as the easier areas to move forward, and then the ones that don't get as high of scores, recognize that as a board these are things that we have to be aware of, that we may not always be thinking of these other aspects of important values that relate to libraries. Because I think, once again, we want to continually have that conversation about strengths and weaknesses, that we need to acknowledge our strengths and acknowledge our weaknesses, because all this has to work together going forward. And I think what one would hope is that as you, as a board, talk about your values, the next time you go do the long-range plan, you might have a slightly different perspective of what types of questions you're going to ask of the community based on the board's own understanding of their values. So that's kind of like a roundabout answer, but I think that the goal is to just find a quick and easy way to introduce this conversation without beating people over the heads with it, but to perhaps reflect on this throughout various board meetings. You know, you can say in your director's report, you know, based on our board's, you know, values, blah, 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 you know, these are some things I thought would be of interest. You know, and also these would be some areas of information related to these other values that we hadn't really thought about as strongly, to sort of create that balance.
One of the tools that's been developed recently over the past year is through the New York Library Association Sustainability Initiative is really looking at the American Library Association's core values of librarianship, and really that might be a tool that could be used when ranking values or identifying values of a board. So if you haven't seen those core values of librarianship, you're all library people. I'm sure you could find that on ALA's site, but that might be an interesting spot to start if you'd want to try having that conversation. Terry, we've got time for one more question, and Lucinda has asked a question which I think a lot of people struggle with, which is on a board where they have adopted a more formal business-like evaluation style, which is more based on judging the individual, versus the less hierarchical version that you're describing with open-ended questions. Do you have any tips for how a board could agree on using the less hierarchical version?
Well, I guess there's two parts to that. I mean, part of it is whether or not they have to use a hierarchical, you know, based on their union or town or other relationships. But what I would encourage them is if they don't want to immediately just throw it out, maybe section by section start to shift so that you know, maybe on some aspects of the evaluation process it's more open-ended and some it's still a bit more quantitative. And over time, you know, make that transition. If you're willing to just sort of go for it, what I would encourage you to do is think about in each of those sections, what is it that you're really trying to evaluate? I mean, what are the core elements that are the most important? And then how can those elements be asked in a more open-ended perspective so that it's not necessarily yes, no, but rather in what ways has this occurred?
Great. So it doesn't have to be a binary switch from one to the other. It could be a gradual progression that helps shift that conversation from the more binary to the actual more conversational style that you're recommending.
Very much. I think one of the biggest challenges is, you know, like I said before, most of our organizations have been around for a long time, and when we're sort of set in how we've done things. So this is a change, and sometimes incremental change is the most successful change.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. We really appreciate the time you gave us this morning. I think it's important that I see a nice mix of both trustees and directors on the attendee list today, because it really is that partnership that makes a successful library. So understanding best that evaluation doesn't have to be a scary or punitive thing, but can be a tool that helps to advance the library, I think is a very positive way to think about evaluations in the future. And so thank you for helping kind of get us wrapping our minds around that construct as we think about how we transform ourselves to make sure we can help transform communities too. So thanks everyone for being here today. This session was recorded and will be available through midhudson.org, so we'll send that link out to you when it's available. If you'd like to share that with your fellow trustees, that might be a way to start a conversation, especially if your board hasn't done a director evaluation in quite some time, or more likely hasn't evaluated themselves in quite some time. So we hope today was useful for you. You'll be getting an evaluation form electronically, and we encourage you to fill that out. That always helps us figure out how to fine-tune training and make sure we get topics that you're most interested in on the schedule for the coming year. So again, thank you, Terry, and thanks everyone who came today.